This is a brief timeline of the Vietnam War from 1954 to 1975. But first, a little background. From the late 1800s to the start of World War II, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were French colonies. The area was called French Indochina. Occupied by Japan during the Second World War, the colonies were returned to the French at the war's end in 1945. However, in northern Vietnam, a party called the Viet Minh, under the nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh, did not recognize France as ruler and proclaimed Vietnam an independent country and assumed power. This resulted in the First Indochina War between the French and Viet Minh forces. At that time, military aid to the French began, first by President Harry Truman and later by President Eisenhower. Despite this, major hostilities ended in 1954 with the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and this is where our timeline begins. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, a meeting was held in Geneva where a ceasefire was signed. France agreed to withdraw its troops from the region, and French Indochina was divided into three independent countries: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel into North and South Vietnam until elections could be held to unite the country. However, the proposed national election failed to occur, and in 1959, a Viet Cong guerrilla operation supported by the North began in the South. Concerned about the expansion of communism in the region, President Kennedy in 1961 sent 400 American Green Beret special advisors to South Vietnam to train South Vietnamese soldiers in methods of counterinsurgency against Viet Cong guerrillas. In this escalating war, much of the manpower and material for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army arrived in the South via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This route originated in North Vietnam, was over 600 miles long, and ran along the Cambodia and Laos borders with Vietnam. It traversed rugged jungle terrain and dense rainforests, and except for river crossings and bridges, was virtually invisible from the air. As a result, in 1962, prior to entering the war with ground troops, the U.S. provided military support to the South, with U.S. aircraft dropping Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle protection of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then, in 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, in the Gulf of Tonkin, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In retaliation, carrier-launched A-4 Skyhawk fighter bombers attacked North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases, and President Lyndon Johnson received authorization from Congress to increase the U.S. military presence in Vietnam. It was now a full-scale war between North and South, fought exclusively in the South, and it continued until 1975. The North Vietnam Army, along with South Vietnam guerrillas, the Viet Cong, fought the South Vietnam Army, who were supported primarily by the U.S., with limited troops from Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Thailand. B-52 bombers, fighter bombers, and helicopters dominating the skies supported ground operations in South Vietnam. These planes were launched from airfields in South Vietnam, from U.S. aircraft carriers, and from bases in Guam, Okinawa, and Thailand. U.S. air power inflicted heavy damage to the enemy, but at the expense of almost 10,000 aircraft lost by enemy surface-to-air missiles and Russian aircraft. helicopter gunships and troop carriers, including the Huey and Chinook, introduced new tactics in supporting ground troop operations. They attacked enemy targets and transported troops to and from battle areas. The Air Force 105 Thunder Chiefs conducted the majority of the bombing early in the war, with over 20,000 missions flown. It was the largest single-seat, single-engined combat aircraft in history and could reach speeds twice the speed of sound. The Mark II F-4 Phantom was one of the principal air superiority fighters in the ground attack and aerial reconnaissance roles in the Vietnam War. Navy Air Force Skyhawks attacked enemy targets and provided ground support for Allied troops. Lieutenant Colonel John McCain, 2008 presidential candidate, flying an A-4, was shot down on a low-altitude bombing run over Hanoi in 1967 and remained a POW for 5 years. American ground troops entered the war with the arrival of U.S. Marines at Da Nang in 1965. From that time until 1973, American troops fought alongside the South Vietnamese Army in their battles against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. There were brief exchanges of territory and many attack and withdrawal operations conducted by both North and South forces. The Battle of La Drang Valley in 1965 was the first major battle for U.S. troops. Helicopters flew directly into the battle zone and engaged in fierce firefights to defeat the enemy. The heavy casualties on both sides were typical throughout the conflict. At about this time, anti-war protests began in America. A number of universities protested Vietnam policies of the U.S., and anti-war rallies took place in 40 American cities. There were search and destroy missions in the Bon Son Plain and in the Iron Triangle's network of Viet Cong tunnels just north of Saigon. A North Vietnam siege of U.S. Marines at Con Thien was lifted following heavy B-52 airstrikes, and massive airstrikes at Dak To forced the enemy to withdraw into Laos and Cambodia. At Khe Sanh, a 77-day siege of 5,000 Marines ended following the sustained B-52 bombardment of North Vietnamese Army troops. During this siege, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, attacking over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, capturing many of them. However, South Vietnamese troops and U.S. forces, aided by American air and artillery strikes, counterattacked and retook the lost territory, inflicting substantial losses on the enemy. In May 1968 at Dai Do, a North Vietnamese attempt to open an invasion corridor into South Vietnam was halted by a battalion of U.S. Marines nicknamed the Magnificent Bastards. 1 year later, President Nixon announced a Vietnamization of the war and a phased U.S. troop withdrawal began. Despite secret peace talks in Paris, the war continued. South Vietnamese troops, aided by heavy U.S. artillery and airstrikes, attacked into Cambodia and Laos in an unsuccessful attempt to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then, in 1972, an attempt to force North Vietnam to make concessions in the peacegoing talks, President Nixon authorized heavy bombing raids in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. However, the strategy didn't work, and later in the year, in the Eastertide Offensive, 200,000 North Vietnamese Army troops waged an all-out offensive to conquer South Vietnam. Its major objectives were to capture Quang Tri City, Hue, and Binh Long province. But after 3 months of intense fighting, the South Vietnamese, with the help of B-52 bombers, forced the North Vietnamese to withdraw from the area. In 1973, a ceasefire agreement was finally reached in Paris, and the last American troops left Vietnam. Then, in December 1974, North Vietnam violated the Paris Peace Treaty by attacking Phuoc Long Province and began plans for the invasion of South Vietnam. 3 months later, the final offensive began as 25,000 North Vietnamese Army troops attacked and began their occupation of South Vietnam. By the end of April, with Saigon about to fall, the helicopter evacuation of 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese from Saigon began, and by April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese troops poured into Saigon, and the last Americans, 10 Marines from the embassy, departed Saigon, concluding the United States presence in Vietnam. The war was over. Calculations of the total number of deaths in the Vietnam War vary widely depending on the time period and area covered by the data. It was estimated in 1978 there were 1,313,000 total deaths in North and South Vietnam from 1965 to 1974, the time period when the U.S. was most engaged in the war. In November 1982, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated. It chronologically lists the names of more than 58,000 Americans who gave their lives in service to their country. 2 years later, the Three Soldiers statue becomes part of the memorial, and in 1993, a second statue commemorating American nurses in the war is added.